Good evening, everybody. My name is Carol Weinshell. I'm the Vice President of Program and Membership at Congregation Rodeph Sholom in Bridgeport, Connecticut. You all know who I am, but I introduce myself all the time, so we have this recording for posterity. Today is February 7th. We have, back by popular demand, our own Rabbi Richard Eisenberg and Paul Friend. They are going to be talking about Jews and comedy. And before the program officially begins, I'm turning the screen over to Rabbi Eisenberg. So welcome, everybody, and thank you for coming.
Thank you, Carol. Welcome, everybody. Before we actually begin the program, I would like to just say, because as Jews, we are extremely connected, not only to one another, but to what goes on in the outside world. That we don't believe in being insular, although we have to be sometimes. But we believe that we are concerned and we care about the outside world, especially when there is suffering going on. So even though this is a program, and maybe even especially, because this is a program focusing on the lighter side, which we are going to see actually are very serious aspects of Jewish humor too. But it's very important to make note of the catastrophic earthquakes that have devastated Turkey and northern Syria, and the thousands of lives that have been lost. People who are untold numbers of people who are missing, people who have been thousands upon thousands who have been severely injured, many even more who have been displaced. And so before we begin our actual program, I just wanted to remember their plight, to pray that those who were injured in this disaster will find healing, that all those who have been affected by this catastrophe will find healing and will regain their footing and be able to reclaim their lives, and that the memory of all those who perished be blessed. So having said that, Paul, I know it's really, I can depend on you to shift the focus, to shift the mood, just like that. So time for you to do your magic. I'm going to turn it over to Paul to open, and then we're going to also talk, after Paul opens, we're going to talk a little bit about some of the biblical basis of Jewish comedy before we go even further into chronology. Go ahead, Paul. And thank you, Paul.
You're welcome. Hello, everyone. I see there's 32 people on. On Yom Kippur, a Reform rabbi, hope there aren't any on screen, decides that he's going to get in some golfing early in the morning. He's going to golf 9 holes. So he starts to golf, and the angel sees what's going on, and he reports this to God. And God says, I'll take care of this. God creates the winds to blow in such a way that the rabbi gets unexpected holes in one on the 6th and the 8th holes. The angel says, God, far be it from me to question you, but what did you just do? And God says in a low conspiratorial voice, who's he gonna tell?
Never heard that joke.
Okay. And yeah, it's weird. Everyone on mute, you can't hear the laughter, and like faces. Some of them are laughing and some of them are like, I'm trying to work that into a comedy.
Some of them are rolling their eyes, Paul.
Yeah, well, I could, all right. Yeah, I could do, no, I'll hold off the Jewish rabbi jokes. To me, that joke almost, encapsulates a lot of Jewish humor. It is self-deprecating. I used to mispronounce that word to my regret. My wife and Sigmund Freud made that same observation. My wife recently, Sigmund Freud, about 100 years ago, in his interpretation of dreams, that so much of Jewish humor is, he didn't mean this negatively, it was more of an observation. Jewish humor is inward turning. It may be critical of the self or the Jewish group. It is not outwardly insulting. It is not critical of the other. Now, there are some exceptions, as we'll talk about. Don Rickles kind of broke the mold there, but generally, Jewish humor, first off, turns inward. Second, a lot of it is based on wordplay, and a lot of it involves a lot of what we'll call intellectual tricks and games that often with Jewish humor, the listener has to really think and use his cop and figure out what's going on. Often in Jewish humor, there's almost like that pause. You tell the joke and then there's a few seconds and then laughter comes in. It doesn't immediately go for the jugular vein of immediate comedy, immediate laughs. There's other types of humor that do that, but Jewish humor is sometimes, I call it the, let's figure out how we get to comedy. Oh yeah, that's funny. Here's another example of a Jewish rabbi joke, hopefully not too insulting to anybody. Two Jewish rabbis are talking about the problem they have with squirrels in their attic. And one rabbi says, well, listen, I didn't want to do it, but I called the exterminator and that solved the problem. The other rabbi said, I gave all the squirrels bar mitzvahs and that solved the problem.
I never heard that joke, Paul.
So you may have to think about that one. But again, classic Jewish humor. It's about ourselves, and it does involve, a bit of trickery. Why is that funny? Because it's not an immediate ha, but there you have it. Now, I think I'll stop with the Jewish rabbi comedy, but I thought that those two jokes, to my mind, kind of symbolize a lot of Jewish humor in the things that make up and compose Jewish humor. Those two jokes, they tell me, and hopefully the rest of you, a lot about what's going on. So Rabbi, if you want to start with the biblical roots, I can turn it back over to you.
Thank you, but I actually do want to add an example of, you mentioned Jewish humor is often self-deprecating. That's a major feature of Jewish humor. Here's what I would call a pretty extreme example of that, which is really an old joke. It's like an old joke, but this is really self-deprecating humor to the nth degree. A Jewish man moves in next door to noted anti-Semite Henry Ford. And Ford accosts his new neighbor one day and says, I bet you think that by moving here, you're as good as I am, don't you? Upon which the neighbor responds, no, I think I'm better than you are. And Ford demands, well, how do you figure that you're better than I am? To which the Jewish guy replies, well, for one thing, I don't live next door to a Jew.
Yeah.
So, okay, I mean, look, it's an old joke. It's a problematic joke. We laugh at it, okay? Because we kind of can't help laughing at it. I mean, it's ultimate absurdity, but it's self-deprecating. It's like the way we make fun of ourselves or even deprecate ourselves. Now, going all the way back to the Bible for a moment, what's one of the first examples? Oh, by the way, I have to say, when I was at B'nai Jacob, in Woodbridge some years ago, and I once gave a course in Jewish humor in the Bible, biblical humor in the Bible. And so I was giving examples, and maybe during the second class, one of my congregants named Shirley says to me, Rabbi, I don't see what's funny about any of this. I felt like in that moment, I totally had to revamp the whole curriculum, that I was definitely missing something. But biblical humor is different than the humor we're used to, right? Very different. But there are elements in biblical humor to what we have now. And I'm not going to give a whole class in that. I'm just going to give you a few examples. Okay, what's so funny about Abraham and Sarah? What's so funny about Sarah getting pregnant at age 90 when Abraham is age 99? Is there anything funny about that? Well, think about it, right? Sarah and Abraham are visited by angels. They both laugh when the angels say to them, Sarah, you haven't been able to have a child, but you're going to conceive at age 90. Sarah, listening to the conversation, what does she do? She laughs, hence the name Yitzchak, by the way. The child will be called Isaac. But she laughs and she says to herself, Achare veloti, I'm hoping I'll get it, the Hebrew right. Achare veloti, haitali edna, vadoni zaken. That after I have, now that I am postmenopausal, which is basically what it means, now that I am postmenopausal, I'm going to have pleasure with my husband being as old as he is. So in other words, what was Sarah thinking about? She was thinking about the conjugal act with her 99-year-old husband and the idea that he's going to impregnate her. And that cracks her up. Okay? So that's an early example of biblical humor. Again, it's not belly laughing humor, but it's kind of on the light side. As a kind of a acknowledgement of that, the child is called Isaac, meaning, and he will laugh. And then the next example, I'm just going to give you a couple of more. The next one, well, of course, Paul, I didn't talk to you about this one, but I'm going to kind of throw it in. Jacob and Rachel and Leah, right? So Jacob works for 7 years for Laban, right? He thinks he's working for him so he can marry Rachel, right? You all know the story. What does Jacob do? He pulls the royal switch on the wedding night, puts Leah in a thick veil. Jacob has relations with her. They consummate the marriage, not knowing who she is, which is funny as it is. Like, he doesn't see her face the whole night. Like, what is this? He wakes up in the morning, the Bible says, and behold, it is Leah. Then he goes to complain to Laban. Laban says, well, okay, but in our culture, we don't marry the younger one before the older one. So you can have Rachel once your wedding week with Leah is concluded, but you have to work an additional 7 years for her. To which Jacob basically says, okay, no problem. I mean, it's funny. It's ridiculous, right? That he's going to work another 7, just like that. Okay, you switched it around, you disguised, your daughter to, and now, okay, big deal. I'll work another 7 years. Who cares? I'm going to live 180 years or whatever they lived in the Bible. He actually didn't live that long, but he lived, very, in Genesis, they lived a very long time. So what's another 7 years? Funny on a certain level. The last thing is Joseph. And by the way, notice a lot of this humor has sexual undertones, maybe even overtones. Okay, Joseph and Potiphar's wife. So you all know the story with Joseph, right? Brothers are jealous, coat of many colors, throw him in the pit. He's rescued by the Midianites. He's enslaved into the house of Potiphar. He becomes second in the house only to Potiphar, but Potiphar's wife has the hots for him, right? And she is hounding him day and night to seduce him. And he continues to refuse, right? To the point where on one particular day, Potiphar and everyone else in the house is gone on some errand, and she corners Joseph, demanding that he have sex with her. And he refuses, and he runs away. He turns around to run off. But what happens as he's turning around to run off? She grabs his cloak. And in the process of grabbing his cloak, he runs off without his cloak. So is it an outside cloak or is it an indoor cloak? And it's entirely plausible that in this case, even though Potiphar's wife may not have gotten everything she wanted from Joseph, she certainly got a peek. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
Okay. So,
Rabbi, can I add a
go ahead.
biblical?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, yeah, don't just steal your thunder. Yeah, like we're like a vaudeville act. Moving ahead in the Bible, another bit of comedy and yet another essential part of Jewish humor is making fun of the enemy. I should have mentioned that at the beginning, but this may be a better introduction to it. And I'm thinking in particular, since we're talking biblical stories, well, one that comes to mind, and possibly the earliest example of making fun of the other, is Purim. I think I pronounced that correctly.
Purim.
So Purim, it's a Jersey accent that I've acquired over the years. The story of Purim, the spiels and the celebrations that have evolved over the years, is really remarkable. The noise making of Haman. I told Rabbi the story that my mom reminds me of this all the time. The old saying at work, if you're sick and there's an assignment, you usually get the bad role. I was sick one Wednesday afternoon in 1972 or thereabouts, and I was assigned the role of Haman in the Hebrew school play of the Purim story. When I heard about this, I got very upset because I didn't want to play the bad guy. And I think I was assigned, the role of, guard number 2 or something like that. But little Paul kind of missed the point because, the story in the play, is kind of mocking Haman. It's not saying, oh, yeah, but bad guy, and we love bad guys. Quite the opposite. So again, I'll repeat, I think I kind of misunderstood what was going on. But the point is that if you think about it, in these other stories that we told and other stories that we will tell, I don't think that there's any major organized religion in this world we know that has so many elements of comedy that are biblically sourced as, or from any source for that matter, like Judaism has. Another thing, although this is really, maybe now I'm getting really off into the weeds. I always thought that the Simchat Torah celebration was fun and exuberant, marching around the synagogue, celebrating the conclusion of this cycle and the start of the next cycle. We don't see that type of celebration, at least as far as I know, in other major world religions. So in that sense, I've always believed that we as Jews, regardless of whether you're religious, conservative, reform, reconstructionist, or whatever, have something special that we have to share with ourselves in the world. So, Rabbi, those are some of the biblical stories I can think of. Anything else?
Yeah, there's really nothing funny about the Purim story. I mean, when you think about it,
And
this is a story of a man's plot to exterminate the Jews of Persia, right?
Yeah.
So how many world religions or cultures would take a story like that and turn it into a joke? And that's what we did.
Yes.
Purim has become, a time of jokes and merriment, and you hear the name of Haman and you twirl the grogger, and and people drink alcohol, and they celebrate, they make masquerades and costumes, and it becomes a big Purim spiel, a big Purim joke, which is really remarkable, and it's kind of symbolic. Paul and I were talking about this when we were discussing this class. It's really symbolic of what the Jewish community has had to do as a coping mechanism for the centuries, as a persecuted people, as a people who have never really been able to feel completely safe, completely secure wherever we are, right? And one of the coping mechanisms for that is humor. I'm going to tell, and then we're going to get to the 20th century in a minute. But Paul, I just want to lay out, and I'm going to ask you to add if you want, a little
Sure.
groundwork about the 19th century, because when we talk about Jewish comedy, we're focusing mostly on America, mostly, okay? And but we have to at least make a quick allusion to the 19th century comedy of the shtetl of Eastern Europe, primarily. You know, I mean, when you think of Western Europe, when you think of Yekis, you know, German Jews, enlightened cultural, Jews of Germany of the 19th century and so on, you don't necessarily think of them as being such funny people. You just don't, okay? But when you think of the Jews of the shtetl or Eastern Europe, you think of Shalom Aleichem, you think of the Tevye cycle, the Tevye stories. You think of Yud Lamed Peretz, and Mendel Moicher Sfarim, another great Yiddish a writer and a storyteller. And, humor they were filled with humor. When you think about Yiddish, you think about, I was reading a story about the Three Stooges, and in one of their kind of clips, one of their, 20-minute or half-hour comedies where they were making fun of Nazi Germany, and Mo is standing up there, Mo Howard, he's standing up there like dressed like Hitler and imitating him, and he's speaking, and instead of like people think he's speaking German, but he's speaking Yiddish. He's throwing out expressions in Yiddish that only Yiddish speakers would understand, but most of America, people in Kansas, in Montana, are watching this in the movie theaters as short subjects, and they're laughing their heads off. Oh, this is so funny. They don't know that Mo is actually speaking Yiddish and joking around in Yiddish, So one of the cycles of stories, and then I'm going to throw it back to my friend, Mr. Friend, attorney friend, is the Chelm stories. Okay, the wise men of Chelm, which came out of Eastern Europe. There are so many Chelm stories. I'll just tell you one. It's just to give you, an idea of the Chelm stories. This is very short. A fire broke out one night in the city of Chelm, and all the inhabitants rushed to the fiercely burning building to put out the fire. When the conflagration had finally been put out, the rabbi mounted a table and addressed the citizens. My friends, this fire was a miracle sent from heaven above. There were murmurs of surprise in the crowd, and the rabbi hastened to explain. Look at it this way, he said. If it were not for the bright flames, how would we have been able to see how to put the fire out in the first place? That's an example of the absurdist humor of Chelm. There are so many Chelm stories. We could have a class just on Chelm stories to kind of laugh at and analyze their humor. Paul, anything to add about, the Eastern Europe, 19th century before we move into the 20th century?
No, I think that was a good summation. So we can pick up with the 20th century.
Okay,
Like,
take it away wherever you want to start.
okay, so as I may have told people before the broadcast began, I do have my computer there, so I can do some quick research on the fly, but I'm telling you that. And something that I want to tell you that kind of speaks for itself. Rabbi referred to the Three Stooges. He referred, I think, to Mo Howard. Real name, Moses Horowitz. Larry Fine, Louis Feinberg from Philadelphia. Shemp Howard, Samuel Horowitz. Curly Howard, Jerome Horowitz. Joe Besser, that was his real name. And Curly Joe DeRita was actually Joe Wardell. There were 6 guys that ultimately portrayed the Three Stooges. And you know what they all had in common? They were all Jewish. And yeah, you didn't necessarily know that, but as Rabbi said, they would throw out Yiddishisms and phrases and such. So if you really knew what was going on, you'd pick up on it. But I just wanted to share that little anecdote. That's always been a common thing in Hollywood, the changing of the name. But, certainly as a kid watching the Three Stooges on, TV, maybe channel 11 or 5, if you folks know, I think most of you know what I'm talking about. We weren't saying, oh, that guy's real name is Horowitz. So that was interesting to me, just to learn these things. It's like an endless mine of material to look at.
I'd like to ask a question to people if you don't mind.
Sure.
And I'm going to ask you to put the answer in the chat, and then Carol can monitor it, or we can. Pretty much everybody except for Debbie's granddaughter, who's with us here, everybody pretty much knows what vaudeville. Would somebody like to explain to Debbie's grandmother, and just unmute yourself, if you would, a voice other than Paul or myself. Explain, Debbie, which granddaughter is this?
Emma?
Okay, Emma, would you like to know what vaudeville was? I'm glad you said yes, because if you could easily have said no, I would have said, okay, well, forget it then. We got to do something else. All right, I'm glad you said yes. Would somebody please explain to Emma what vaudeville was? We won't Wikipedia your answer. Just give Emma some idea of vaudeville, like the time of it, when it happened, what it was. Anybody? Unmute yourselves. Be bold. Be brave. What was vaudeville? Or when was vaudeville? Or however you want to answer it.
Hello. Can I
Go
give
ahead.
a shot? Okay, well, it happened, I think, in the late 1890s to the early 1920s. And what it was a mishmash of different entertainment. You had singers, you had dancers, trained dogs, trained ducks, magicians, acrobats, anything and everything they can put on the stage. And what was interesting is that these people were like gypsies. They went all around the country doing their acts. They didn't get paid a lot, but that was the way they lived. And they had a suitcase or a trunk, and they went from town to town entertaining. And some of them became very big stars. They started out in vaudeville, like Jack Benny and
George Burns.
George Burns. A lot of people were in vaudeville, and then as entertainment evolved and TV came and they got into movies, but vaudeville was also the entertainment of the poor. You didn't need a lot of money to go to vaudeville. If you had a lot of money, you went to the opera and you were fancy. But poor people, which is immigrants and people that needed some entertainment, because it was pre-TV, mostly pre-radio, there was nothing else that was entertaining. So it was pretty much the entertainment of the people.
Right, and it's a great explanation. Thank you. And vaudeville was pretty much, it was off Broadway everywhere. I mean, people, when you say it was for the plebeians, right? So vaudeville. So Emma, vaudeville always was on stage. It was always on stage. Like, Emma, did you ever see a Broadway show, like in New York?
Not yet.
She will someday.
Someday.
When COVID comes down. But, you have to pay a lot of money to see Broadway shows. Vaudeville was for everybody, right? And it was filled with comedy. I'd like to ask you just to put in the chat names of vaudeville comedians that you can think of. We already heard two, Jack Benny and George Burns, okay? As you know, both of them were Jewish. Both of them moved from vaudeville to the mainstream. And so, for instance, when people in, I keep saying Kansas and Montana, there are a lot of Jews in Kansas, not so much in Montana. Let's say Montana and Idaho, okay? When people in Montana and Idaho would watch the George Burns and Gracie Allen show, would they immediately have been thinking, oh, George Burns is Jewish, or when they were watching the Jack Benny show. Were they, connecting Jack Benny to his Jewishness? Not necessarily. But these were vaudevillians who made it. Okay, so let's look at some of the so far.
So you have Fanny Bryce and Gracie Burns.
Gracie wasn't Jewish. Gracie Allen, actually, that was part of the, and somebody can correct me if I'm wrong, but that was part of the unsaid joke of that whole thing, was that George was this Jewish kind of guy, and he was a champion, like eyes rolling into his head guy, and Gracie was kind of like always making these funny, mistakes that she didn't mean to make. Yeah, actually she did, but they were funny mistakes, and that George would roll his eyes, but that was an early case of a mixed marriage of a Jewish husband, a non-Jewish wife, who were completely mainstreamed and were absolutely hilarious. The Marx Brothers. Billy said Fanny Bryce, of course. Anybody want to comment on Fanny Bryce? Anybody? Pipe in. Yeah, go ahead, Paul, first. If anybody, pipe in if you want to comment on any of these names.
Yeah, Fanny Bryce, very interesting story. You will, if you know her today, it's because she is the lead character in the fairly fictitious and not that funny musical Funny Girl, which is currently engaged in a revival on Broadway. And what's really interesting about her, and again, there's a whole show about her, and I think there was a sequel, Funny Lady, the movie. Fanny Bryce was originally famous for singing songs written for her by Irving Berlin and others with a Yiddish accent, and people thought it was funny. Well, that's all well and good, but what I didn't know until recently is that I'll just be kind of careful of my words, came from a very upper class Jewish background and didn't have a traditional Jewish or Yiddish accent. She actually had to put on the accent to convey the songs. And that's what people loved, because it sounded so funny. She had a multi-tiered career. I think she became also famous, later in the 40s for the character Baby Snooks. But what I found fascinating, and it's not really, I don't think it's really mentioned in the musical or the movie, is that whereas you think that she is, this certain character, she wasn't. It was show business. She tried it on and it was funny and people liked it. And Mr. Ziegfeld said, yeah, keep on doing this. So I find it funny that even though she got her start singing songs with the accent, it was an act. And, and that's what, and it made her famous, and it made her fortune. She ended up being married, I think, 3 times. Not quite relevant to this, but I find that really interesting, that when you think about Fanny Bryce and her history, a lot of it was based on a put on, and that's okay. It's entertainment, it's show business. So I see Len raising his hand.
Go ahead, Len, unmute yourself.
What I'm going to do. We were speaking about George Burns and Gracie Allen, and I love them. I actually record they have 2 episodes on every morning. I record them and watch them every day because their presentations are still both amazing.
Brilliant.
But when you watch the show, they hid the fact that George Burns was Jewish. It was never mentioned. They speak about Christmas. They speak about the Christmas tree. Yet universal acceptance, they never discuss the fact that he was Jewish. They speak about the Christianity aspect of their relationship.
That's right. And the same thing with Jack Benny. His Jewishness was never discussed. But
Yeah.
What was Jack Benny famous for, people? What was he famous for?
Violin.
Not just the violin. What was he famous for?
Stinginess.
For stinginess.
That's
Yes.
true.
Right. Jewish.
So again, think about the stereotypes of cheap Jew, shyster, this and that.
Your money or
that-
your life.
Yeah, you know,
That's good.
so. think
Well,
about that.
I'm thinking.
Yeah, with Fanny Bryce, one other thing that Paul, Fanny Bryce is an excellent example of an early example of irreverence. So we're going to get to people like Mel Brooks later, probably next time. But you think of Mel Brooks and the producers. We're not going to have time. I think that's going to be for the next class. Okay, the more modern stuff. But how irreverent can that be? I mean, when you think of how that was totally outrageous, right? But think of what Fanny Bryce did to Flo Ziegfeld when she was supposed to do some, song that an unattached, unmarried woman sings, and she came out with a pillow under her dress, pregnant, right? Like pretending she was pregnant. And there might have been a scene of that even in Funny Girl. I don't know, but
There was, yeah.
yeah. And I think there might have been a scene like that in The Great Ziegfeld, the movie from the 1930s with William Powell, about Ziegfeld. That was, in those days to do that, an unwed mother to be was unheard of. You just don't do that. But she got away with it. Right? So there are things that Jews have been able to do over the decades and gotten away with that, first of all, other people may not have gotten away with so easily. And secondly, there were other examples of Jews getting away with stuff like this through humor that they never would have gotten away with if it was through straight essays or speech or other kinds of public discourse. But through humor, they got away with it. Paul, let's look at the list so far. People, can you think of non-Jewish? People put in some Jewish vaudeville. I'm thinking primarily of comedians. People put in entertainers, which is great, but comedians. Can you think of any non-Jewish vaudeville comedians? If so, put them in. Non-Jewish vaudeville. Yeah, anybody.
Well, yeah, I see that there's an interesting two names right after the other, and maybe somebody can help me. People may not remember his name, but George Jessel was a famous comedian of this era.
Yeah.
The human brain starts working the moment you're born and stops when you get up to speak in public. Is, I think, one of his more famous saying.
Yeah.
He actually he began his career giving funeral speeches. It was so good at it that it launched a career in entertainment. But the real reason I mention him is that here's a little known fact. And I saw his name right next to Al Jolson. I don't know if Al Jolson was Jewish or not. I'm embarrassed to admit that. But
He was. Asa Jolson, son of a cantor. Yep.
however, George Jessel, you should all know, was actually going to do the movie The Jazz Singer, which, as you all know or should know, was the first talking moving picture. He had been on it in Broadway.
Played it on Broadway.
Supposed to get it, but he thought so highly of himself that he wanted a lot of money. The movie studio balked. He thought that they would concede. They didn't, and they got Al Jolson. So that's my George Jessel, Al Jolson connection. And again, I'd momentarily forgotten.
Yeah, that's right.
So I just wanted to throw that in there, the Jessel Jolson connection.
So
I don't know if they ever got. So
yeah, I don't. He never lived that down. That he turned that role down. I see a few names that Judy and Lee put up. Gallagher and Sheen were Jewish. I don't know. I don't even know who they were. And Mary Livingston. Anybody hear of her? Was she? She must have been a vaudevillian.
That was Jack
Jack Benny's wife.
wasn't she?
Oh,
Benny's
Mary
wife.
Livingston. Jack. No, she wasn't Jewish.
Jack Benny.
That's what I
She was
thought.
Jack Benny's wife.
Yeah.
Yeah.
She wasn't Jewish.
No, I didn't think so. Right.
So I got it. There must have been some non-Jewish vaudeville comedians. There are plenty, right? But the ones that we think of, and there are others that are escaping my memory right now. who are Jewish. Go ahead, Gracie, I think has her hand up.
Okay, wasn't Bob Hope in vaudeville?
Yeah, but he wasn't Jewish.
Yeah, but you asked for non-Jewish.
Thank you. There you go. Now I can sleep tonight, Gracie. Thank you.
You're welcome.
Definitely Bob Hope.
Hmm.
Bob Hope is a great example. Yeah, he was, and Laurel and Hardy, you know, they were in vaudeville. You know, people like that. Charlie Chaplin. Now, Charlie Chaplin had Jewish ancestry to some degree, but he was not Jewish. He happened to be my favorite, actually. It's interesting that, like, my favorite probably movie director of all time and comedian was Charlie Chaplin, not Jewish. Lana?
Who's this? I just have one small comment about Charlie Chaplin. He was a perfect example of transitioning a radio to the silent
this annoying
movies,
you?
and from silent movie to visual, you know, whatever. And also people used to hide behind the humor, the tragedies and things of that nature that were prevalent in the culture. And Jews are very basically live by what's around them and what's going on at the present time. It was very evident in the, especially, like I mentioned that before in one of your sermons, that you were talking about comedians, that in Russia they used to, very few comedians, but of certain caliber, got away with murder during the
Right.
communist regime, because I don't know how they got away. It was obviously multiple reasons, but it was unthinkable, and yet they still managed to do that. And the other little comment I have is about Yiddish humor. I find personally that when you say something in Yiddish, there's no translation. For example, if you say, may you grow like a cibole, which means an onion, with a head down and feet up. I mean, how do you translate that? I mean, yes, you can translate it, but it's very slappish kind of a thing, you know? And anybody who saw Fiddler on the Roof, just the way his Tevye is thinking and, you know, in his hand manipulating, what would I do on the other hand, on this hand, whatever, all those kind of things are very, at least close to me and understanding and in my experiences in life. So that's the other one
Thank you.
that I want to mention.
Yeah, I'm actually going to comment on that in a second too.
Sorry.
A few names came up. Maury Amsterdam was Jewish, right, from the Dick Van Dyke Show.
Oh, yeah.
Costello, you'd have to look that up, whether they were in vaudeville. Not sure, but that's a great suggestion. Maybe they were. And Mae West and W.C. Fields are great examples from, thank you, Marcia.
Mae West,
Charlie,
I don't think was
Charlie,
Jewish,
did you have your
but-
hand up? Charlie, did you have your hand up? Okay, unmute yourself. Okay.
Milton Berle.
Oh, Milton Berle, great example. Yeah, Milton Berle.
Henny Youngman.
Henny Youngman, right. Great examples of vaudevillians who mainstreamed eventually, right? And again, Milton Berle, another one. I mean, the Milton Berle Show. Everybody watched Milton. Phil Silvers is another one. Everybody watched, you know, Middle America. You know, Sergeant Bilko. I mean, it wasn't Sergeant Bilkowitz. It wasn't Sergeant Bilkoff. It was Sergeant Bilko. I mean, did Middle America think of Sergeant Bilko as a Jewish guy? No, they just, you know, he was a funny guy. Okay, I want to comment on what Lana said a minute ago. Jewish humor, there are certain aspects of it that really distinguish it. It is usually very substantive. It has Jewish humor. There are elements, there are among Jewish comedians and humorists an element of slapstick among some of them, but there's usually a real substance. And even with the slapstick, Sid Caesar, thanks, Chuck. That's another great example. But think of like Charlie Chaplin's slapstick, even though he wasn't Jewish. A lot of Charlie Chaplin's slapstick was ways of sticking it to the aristocracy or the upper class
The man.
or the convention, right? Giving them a shtuch. That's what Chaplin did so brilliantly, right? That there was
Yes.
social commentary, social criticisms. There was often a point. See, and that's the thing about Judaism is we're very much, when we say people of the book, we're very educating and education-minded. And there's a lot of things about Judaism that are didactic, really teaching aspects that actually in humor, a lot of the social critiques and social aspects of Jewish humor were actually didactic, meant to convey some kind of social commentary or message. And I mentioned also the tendency to be anti-authoritarian, because if you're not in authority, right? If you don't have the power, so stick it to the ones who are in power. That's the one thing you can do with your position is you make fun of the people who are in power. And that's what Jews have done so often. So Jewish humor has always had this kind of, not always, but frequently, typically had this kind of a critical edge to it, criticizing and also mocking everyone. And nobody is immune. We'll talk next week or in 2 weeks about Don Rickles and others insult, but even God is not immune to Jewish humor, even God. Okay, Lana had her hand up, and then I'm going to turn it back to Paul to take it back more to the earlier part of the 20th century and maybe stage and screen.
Yeah,
and so on.
we'll get to that.
Lana, go ahead.
I thought Mae West was not Jewish.
Not Jewish.
She's
she
not
was-
Jewish.
Yeah, she
But
was
hold that
linked
thought.
with. Yeah, she was linked with W.C. Fields
Right, right.
as non-Jews who were prominent in vaudeville. Right. Okay. Anybody else have their hand up before Paul? I'm going to get
Jackie Green,
Shecky Green. Great example.
Stephen Lawrence, and Edie Gourmet, my favorite. They singers.
Yeah, not comedians, but who was Jewish there? Was Edie Jewish? Maybe.
I think they both.
I
no?
don't think Steve Lawrence was. I don't know. I'd have to look that up.
Yeah, they're both Jewish.
Billy, what? Billy, who? Billy, what?
They're both Jewish.
Both Jewish?
Yeah.
I think Steve Lawrence and Nina Gourmet were both Jewish.
Yeah.
Thank you. Didn't know that.
I think she was Turkish, something like that.
All right, we'll have to.
Turkish Jew.
And
And,
She's actually, I believe, Sephardic. And I don't know if anyone knows this, but she's a cousin to Neil Sedaka.
who was also Jewish. Yeah.
Yes.
And Chuck just mentioned in the chat, Chuck Zwecker just mentioned Zero Mostel. Of course, you can't even mention Zero Mostel without laughing.
Right.
All right, Paul, turning it back to you.
Sure. We, kind of wrapping up vaudeville, many vaudeville stars, unfortunately, have been forgotten, but, does anyone, born Margaret Paikun, Molly Paikon was a giant in vaudeville, ended up being in Fiddler on the Roof. I don't know if anyone remembers her or not, but that in the day was a big name, even made movies in Europe in the 1930s before the rise of Hitler, but was a big star and continued to act. She died in 1992. Not remembered now, unfortunately, but that's just one example. Now, just like a couple of digressions, then we'll return. My wife mentioned Mae West, and interestingly, I would associate Mae West with something that I would not mention in Jews in comedy. I think Mae West was more involved in the burlesque circuit, and that's not something that Jews were really involved in. That's a whole different story that I'm not going to get into. If anyone wants to know more about it, you can Google it. I think people today tend to confuse vaudeville and burlesque. but you really shouldn't. And if you want to learn a little bit more about burlesque, and it's definitely fading and dying days, The Marvelous Mrs. Maisel, especially the most recent season, definitely the most recent season, that focuses very heavily on the last days of burlesque. But Mae West burlesque, not a lot of Jews, I believe, associated with burlesque. It's not vaudeville. Don't mix them up. A lot of people do.
Yeah, but Paul, your better half just put something in the chat to remind us.
Yes.
That when you come up with names like Zero Mostel and Shecky Green, they were really post vaudevillians. You know, because vaudeville had was dying out by the 1920s.
That's right. And let's, we'll talk about why. So vaudeville, a big deal. And as the person who explained it at the beginning so carefully and correctly said, it was a hodgepodge of entertainment. Burlesque, bawdier. But what killed or led to the end of these art forms, vaudeville and burlesque to a great extent, was the rise of movies, especially talking movies, like The Jazz Singer that we already talked about. With the rise of motion pictures, especially the late 20s, early 30s, definitely fueled, I've always believed, by the Great Depression, because people wanted their entertainment. As my mom would tell you, for a dime, you could go to the movie theater and see the main picture and shorts and cartoons and a newsreel. And my mom said in the afternoons, the 30s and 40s, you could get, for that 10 cents or so, you could get a lot of entertainment for your dime. And if you had another dime or nickel, you could get a lot of food too. So it may be overly simplistic to say it, but it seems to me, from our looking back 90 years, that motion pictures really ended the long streak that vaudeville and also to a certain extent burlesque, which is a separate topic, had. So,
do you want to talk about Minnie's Boys for a minute?
I'm not sure who Minnie's Boys are, though my grandma was Minnie.
The Marx Brothers.
Yeah. All 5 of them were Jews.
Because they represent the transition also from vaudeville to stage to screen. Yeah.
Right. But there is there are a couple of things though before we get into that. What did Jewish comedians and actors and entertainers do after vaudeville? Some of them went into the Borscht Belt, and I'm talking about the Catskills, and I'm a proud owner of a hanger from the Concorde that my dad got for me in about 1970. There were jobs.
How much is it worth? How much is it worth on the open market, Paul?
Let me check and I'll get back to you.
Okay.
But anyway, and I still use it. It's still in good shape after probably like 60 years old. At the Concorde, and by the way, my brother-in-law just said that he honeymooned at the Devilly. In the Borscht Belt, you had, for example, a group of entertainers, hopefully I'm pronouncing this correctly, called tumblers, people who would go around and try to get the dinner guests to laugh and enjoy themselves. One crazy tumbler was kind of known for like barging into people and asking them what they thought of the food, and he would throw plates and glasses around, and people thought he was crazy, and he was. That's Jerry Lewis. Jerry Lewis actually got his start, I believe, as a tumbler at one of those Borscht Belt places, entertaining the audience, and people thought, well, he's crazy, but he's funny too. And that's actually what started his career, as I understand it. So that was one thing that Jewish people who wanted to get into entertainment did. The Borscht Belt, you forget about it, but it was a big thing. Starting in the 30s through the 40s, really took off in the post-war baby boom up until its decline in probably 60s and 70s. That's one thing. Another thing that Jews did, Rabbi, I think I'm correct on this. This is what my research tells me, even though it seems a little off. A number of Jewish comedians that might have been big on the vaudeville circuit not only film, but even to, I'm gonna dare say a bigger extent, according to my research, went into radio. And I think that we talked about that. You know, here's a statistic, and I think my mom has backed it up. In 1948, at 8 o'clock when the Milton Berle show came on, the estimates were like 4 out of 5 Americans tuned into that show, and the country stopped. You don't get, I'm thinking, Ed Sullivan had a big audience for the Beatles in 1964, different topic, but what I'm pointing out is that you don't get that kind of unity where just about everybody is tuning into the same entertainment. But such was the power of radio. I think that the Jewish presence in radio, and I'm talking post-vaudeville, we're talking Depression, World War II, the post-World War II, the beginning of the baby boom, the Jewish influence there, Jack Benny, another example. By the way, Jack Benny really did play the violin, but he said that he got more laughs and more enjoyment by not playing the violin and by telling jokes. So he used it as a prop, even though he really could play. But my point is that Jews really were big in radio, perhaps less in movies in the 30s and 40s. That's my impression. That's my empirical sense. I don't know if I'm exactly right about that, Rabbi, but we can't forget that. I don't know if anyone wants to talk about that, but it's, as we move forward through history, post-vaudeville,
Production.
you have I detect almost a bigger Jewish influence, if you will, in radio than in film, even though, of course, as someone said, yeah, there's a big influence, Jews in the movie studio, but Jewish movie stars, Jewish comedians, the Three Stooges may have been popular with shorts and stuff, but I don't know if they were really dominating. If you look at Academy Awards and things like that, I think that they may have had a bigger influence through the airwaves, through radio. But I'd be interested in anyone's opinion as to how on the mark or off the mark I may be about that.
Yeah, go ahead.
A short comment. There was right after World War II in Catskill, Borscht Belt, there was a lot of Holocaust colonies. My parents owned one of them, and that really contributed to also the shows, the eating together, the holidays. People used to go for Passover there, whatever, and the Florida crowd used to migrate to their colonies later on, and I think, maybe I'm wrong, that the reason why the Jews, maybe some of the contribution that didn't migrate to the visual as soon as like in the later 50s or whatever, is because, if you really think about Jews in higher education and in the United States and all the other, aspects of different lives, it wasn't really they were not very accepted. So therefore, in the radio, you really don't see the facial features. You understand. And also in the entertainment industry, a lot of people use pen names or made up names that sounds better, whatever, but Jews were almost forced to do that, no matter personal comment.
Yeah, and thank you. First of all, Marcia pointed out Burns and Allen, Fanny Brice, and Jack Benny were huge radio stars, not so much Hollywood, except that Jack Benny did act in some movies. He starred in a very famous movie directed by Ernst Lubitsch called To Have and Have Not with Carol Lombard in the early 1940s. But Billy Rappaport pointed out, and I was going to get to that in a moment, that almost all, if not all, the major Hollywood studios were owned by Jews, run by Jews. There were many Jewish directors. Again, the Marx Brothers made it big in film. their first major film was The Coconuts, because they were nuts, so they were called The Coconuts. And it was, again, one of the early talking pictures in 1929. And, if you look at any of the lists of funniest movies of all time, Duck Soup, which was the Marx Brothers, I think, third or fourth movie of 1933, is always near the top of the list, and, fast forwarding about 30 years, beyond that, if you look at many, many lists that tell you the funniest movies of all time, at the top of the list, you will find Some Like It Hot, which was directed by Billy Wilder, famous Jewish director, and starred a very famous Jewish actor by the name of Tony Curtis. So, Jews were very, very dominant in Hollywood. I want to take a minute, because next time we're going to be focusing more on the modern period. And I want to take a minute to invite comments, because we are going to end in about 10, 15 minutes maximum. Some people want to watch the State of the Union address tonight if they can stay up so late, or, some of the precursors to that. Or maybe Len and Janice want to catch a quick episode of Burns and Allen before the State of the Union address, because it's only about 22 minutes long. And I have to note that probably my favorite TV comedy of all time doesn't really have any Jews in it. And that's the great classic original 39. That is The Honeymooners. And none of the four principal stars are Jewish. Some of the people behind the show were probably Jewish, okay? But certainly Jackie Gleason, Art Carney, Joyce Randolph, and I'm having a senior moment. Somebody, who played Ralph Cramden's wife?
Audrey Meadows.
Audrey Meadows.
Audrey
thank you,
Meadows.
Audrey Meadows. She wasn't Jewish, was she? I don't think so. So, and that's
Meryl, I'm sorry, Stiller and Meryl, didn't she come, they couple that came to Rodeph Sholom and did a fundraiser for us. The wife was a convert, but that's an example
converted?
I'm
She
sorry?
converted?
I think so, yeah, I'm pretty sure.
Oh, I didn't know that. Oh,
Well, either way, they made a big deal. Part of their big comedy routine was her Irish background or whatever, as contrasted with his Jewish background, and they made that a butt of a lot of their humor. Yeah. All right. I want to invite other comments from people who haven't had a chance yet to share. So Lenny, I see your hand, but I just want to be sure if there's anybody first who hasn't had a chance to share, and then Lenny, I'll give you your turn. But if you haven't had a chance to make a comment or share a question, please do so now by unmuting yourself. Michael Klein said, your brother was a scenic designer? Whoa, on the Jackie Gleason show, the variety show? That is definitely cool. The one that he did in Miami Beach?
In Miami Beach in New York, I used to go to the shows all the time.
Lucky you.
He was also scenic designer for the Captain Kangaroo show and the Merv Griffin show. When Merv Griffin moved to California, he stayed in New York and got married, and he lives in California now.
Very interesting. Very interesting. Wow, thanks for sharing that.
Okay.
Yeah, that's cool about your brother. Okay, Len, go ahead. You had a comment?
Yes, there was a feature at the 92nd Street Y about this topic a number of years ago, and it was recorded and it was shown on JBS a number of times. And the moderator was Michael Krasny. And the reason that he was the moderator is he wrote this book, Let There Be Laughter, which is exactly what we're talking about tonight, this history of Jewish humor and by category and category. And I recommend it to anybody here.
Right, and there are other books like Moshe Waldach's The Big Book of Jewish Humor. Joseph Telushkin wrote a book, very good book, an analysis of Jewish humor. we're just really touching the tip of the iceberg here, but it's just, a chance to get together and talk on the brighter side about some of the major contributions to Jewish Americans over the 20th century. Other comments, Paul, I want to just throw it back to you for a moment to see if you have any closing comments before we begin to wrap it up.
Sure.
And start thinking
Yeah.
about our next class. Yeah.
Well, in the person we spoke about 5 minutes ago made a really interesting comment about, why is it that maybe the Jews were big and popular on radio, but not necessarily visually presenting. I think there's a lot of truth to that, and I guess we can talk about it next week. In the 50s, we had a number of people who were famous as writers of shows. You may have heard of Carl Reiner, a guy named Woody Allen that we will talk about, even though he's controversial, etc. You had Jews who were animators. A lot of cartoons. If you look at the credits of cartoons, you see a lot of Jewish names in there that I didn't really think about when I was a kid. But who's this Fritz Freeling or blah blah blah?
Looney Tunes.
Again, they're there, but they're behind the scenes. It's kind of interesting after the vaudeville, that you see it drop into radio, and then are you seeing them visually? In the 50s, you see the writers. They're not necessarily the big guys on TV, and then that will lead us to the 60s, and when you have a very, very interesting type of Jewish humor, where it's definitely visual. It's stand-up comedians that are breaking out for perhaps the first time, with some of the humor very wild. And yes, I'm looking at you, Mart Saul, and even more so Lenny Bruce. And yes, Woody Allen. We'll talk about that. And then we just go off the deep edge in this for the 70s over the last 50 years of the wacky variety, or wide variety, more likely, of a Jewish humor. Here's a tidbit for you. I didn't know until last week that Andrew Dice Clay is Jewish, but yes, he is. I thought he was an Italian guy from New Jersey. No, he's a Jewish guy from New Jersey.
Definitely a credit to our race, Paul.
And yet he's part of the story.
Yeah.
Something to be proud of.
But yeah, and just the wide variety, when it's the opposite of you don't see us, it's the boy, are you going to see us? And yes, we're going to be in your face.
In your face.
And yet, I'll make the argument, folks, that you can still draw, even though it may seem a little weird, you can still draw a line from biblical stories to now. I think you can. Again, that line may be fuzzy and strange, but you may think, oh, gee, these are radical, and where do they come from? I think you can see the DNA if you trace it back far enough.
Right.
There.
I'm going to close with this before I turn it over to Carol, unless there are other comments. I'm going to close with this. Remember, I said that the 3 Genesis humor stories, one of the things that connected all of them was issues of human sexuality, right? And so nowadays, think like Sarah Silverman, think Amy Schumer, okay? Think of comedians like that who use sex and sexuality as a major theme of their humor. They didn't get it from nowhere. It has actual biblical roots, believe it or not. Okay, any final comments before, I just want to be sure, is there anybody else who hasn't had a chance to say anything? Oh, wait, somebody, is that Sheila?
That's me.
Sheila, this better be good.
Well, I don't know if it refers to this or not, but weren't a lot of people's careers ruined, directors, movie stars, by the Joe McCarthy era?
Yes.
Yes.
Okay.
Very severely.
This is
And
Lee.
the Army,
That was a terrible time. Yeah.
Yeah, by the
Yes.
Committee on, what is it, the House
Un-American
Un-American.
activities.
American. But that has a lot to do with the communism and the,
Yeah, that's
Post-war.
That's a
black
whole-
sheep in the family.
post-war and Iron Curtain. Thank you, Sheila. That was good, Sheila.
I have something to add.
Go ahead.
All right, there was anti-Semitism in entertainment. Specifically, Walt Disney, when he produced Snow White, he was accused of making the witch too close to an elderly Jewish woman, and he got a lot of flack for that.
Interesting. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
He also spied for Un-American Affairs.
Yeah.
He was
But then, after the war, you had the movie Gentleman's Agreement,
Oh, yeah, yep.
which is a whole other story, but, with the intent of exposing anti-Semitism within our own, borders of the United States and among the upper crust. So look, that's why I said, we've just touched the tip of the iceberg here, but I'm already wondering about next year, whether a good topic might be Jews in cinema. But we'll see. We'll think about it. Okay, Carol, turning it over to you.
Thank you, Rabbi. Thank
Carol
you.
from sunny Florida is broadcasting to us now.
Yes, I am. So I want to thank Rabbi Eisenberg and Paul Friend. Tonight was a record for us. We had 46 people on Zoom. I'm delighted. This was the highest number we have had for night program, and that includes our own Emma Bowles, who was the star of the show, the little star. The second part of this, so you shouldn't get confused, is not next week, but in 2 weeks. It's on the 21st. Same time, same Zoom, different date. So I'd like to thank you all again for coming. This was a wonderful program, as always, which is why you're back for based on popular demand, and we certainly will look at next year. We just have to finish this year first. So thank you, everybody, and have a good evening.
Thanks, Carol. And
Thank you.
Thank you.
Carol, is it
Thank you.
okay? I didn't ask Paul, but can Paul and I stay on for an extra 5-10 minutes?
Of course, I'm
In case anybody else wants to just talk amongst yourselves,
well, I'm
you
going,
can maybe stop the recording.
that's what I'm going to do. I'm stopping the recording now.